Okay, now I just want to collect some information just so we know what we're dealing with here. Give you a couple of minutes to answer the poll. Just want to find out how many people are, if there's anybody from the US, because there are slight differences in the laws, etc., from the US and Canada. So yeah, appreciate if you could give that. We'll give it another minute or two. Okay. We'll just end the poll. Give you take a minute to look at it. We do have some people from the US, so that's good. We'll give you a little background of why that question in a minute, or a little more than a minute. Now we're going to resume the sharing. And for everybody who has joined, we're going to start now and go through this presentation. It'll be available so you can look at it later on our YouTube channel. For anybody who hasn't know, we have introduced the safety training requirements in 2024. There is a shortage of courses for people to take. So if you can't get the training, we will grant an exemption for the boats that can't get enough people with the training to crew that boat. So there's information there on how to do that. We're recording this, so if you're staying on or you want to speak, that's your implicit permission. Okay, it's a small group, so if you can pop up any questions you have as we go through. If there's a lot on it, and then it's a little harder to do, but that we should be okay. Here's, if you want to raise your hand, you can do that through here. And if you want to unmute, you can unmute yourself or just depress the space bar. Most people know what LOOR is. We run the Susan Hood, the LO 300, and the Lake Ontario Shorthanded series. You can go to our website or email us for more information. My get out of free jail card is I'm not a lawyer and I'm not necessarily an expert. So please don't necessarily rely on what I'm saying as expert or legal advice. Check it out. The purpose is to talk about the various methods of communications available to people in LOOR races, especially the overnight races, and if you have an emergency, how to engage the search and rescue services. What are the other mechanisms that might be available to you if that doesn't work, and provide some references. Some of the information was provided by Prescott Coast Guard Radio, and we're denoting that on the upper right-hand corner. Many thanks to them for the material and for their services to boaters on Lake Ontario and racers in LOOR events. This is a little symbol that I have. There's a couple of things in here that you might think that LOOR is being kind of a pain in the neck or butt on, and we're going to explain the reason why we do really focus on them. If you'll discover if you're involved in emergencies or crises, that the thing that runs through as a thread that makes everything worse is the failure to communicate. As the Marvin paranoid robot kept saying, don't panic. But if you're telling somebody in a crisis situation, don't panic, they're liable to panic. So what you need to do is be prepared. And what you need to understand is how to effectively communicate while your ship is sinking. You need to have a sort of a plan or discussion in advance. You need to understand how to reach the primary responders, and you need to know what they're looking for in case there's an interruption in communications. And you need to know what the alternate channels are if it doesn't work. And you need to know how to communicate with people who are looking for you or getting close to rescuing you. Transborder issue. The border between Canada and the US runs through Lake Ontario. So there are search and rescue groups in Canada and the US. They cooperate with each other and they won't let the border stand in the way of a rescue. But we can sometimes not help out by the way we communicate with them. I was running a race for Queen City Yacht Club in the Toronto Inner Harbor and listening to a conversation where somebody called for help, a mayday, and it was picked up by the US Coast Guard, and they asked where they were. The person kept saying, "Oh, I'm just off the spit." So contrary to belief, Toronto is not the center of the universe. People might not know what the spit is. So there was this long conversation between the US Coast Guard and the people just off Toronto trying to figure out where they were. So it's important to make sure you're communicating in a way that is understood by the people that are receiving the message. Obviously, telling somebody the spit who's in Buffalo doesn't really help the situation. So who is the On-Water 911 service? It's called the Coast Station or Coastal Station. This goes back all the way to the days of Marconi and the sinking of the Titanic. These were set up, some of them private, some of them public, to facilitate communications and emergency situations. They're still called a coast station, but their number is greatly reduced because of technological changes. So who is the Lake Ontario's Coast Radio Station? It's Prescott Coast Guard Radio. Its call sign is VBR, and that's their MMSI. We'll get that a little later. And that actually looks like what their setup is. I'm not sure if that's the one at Prescott. I actually visited it there, but it looks a lot like their room. So Prescott's area of responsibility, it's Canadian waters only, and it goes from the Cornwall Island at the east and St. Lawrence River to the eastern end of Lake Erie, plus Trent Severn Waterway, parts of the Rideau Waterway, and for various reasons that we won't get into tonight, they actually deal with communications for Winnipeg in Manitoba. So I'm sure none of the radio operators. Sorry, somebody could please go on mute. Okay. Yeah, so they'd handle all the VHF marine traffic for Lake Winnipeg. Here's an example of their area, excluding Lake Winnipeg. The dots are the towers. And you will notice that they're spread across the lake and one up in Aurelia so that they can get good coverage of their area. The other thing, the fact that they have multiple antennas, is they can do triangulation on a broadcast if they're emergency. If you can't provide them the location, they're able to work it out through radio direction finder because of the, it should be picked up by 2 or more of the antennas. Now, it's important to understand that there's two groups involved. One is Prescott Coast Guard Radio, which does the communications. The other is the Joint Rescue Coordination Center at Trenton. That's the group that actually coordinates the rescue and uses Prescott as the communications vehicle. It's called a Joint Rescue Coordination Center because it's made up of people from the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Coast Guard. The world is divided up into rescue coordination centers, and they all cooperate with each other. But that's important to understand that if you make a mayday, it's picked up by the Prescott Coast Guard Station, then they relay it to the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, who tasks the various resources to come out and give aid. So how to reach Prescott Coast Guard Radio? Oops, there's this there is Simplex using channel 16, the International Hailing and Distress channel. You could use the duplex channels, or you could use the MMSI number. So that's one of the reasons why I got the arrows in the wrong place, is that we push for people have a DSC radio with MMSI capability, because you can use that to communicate with other boats or with Prescott. Also, you could either phone them at that telephone number, or only in Canada, if you're connecting to a Canadian cell tower on a cell phone, you can dial *16. It will get you to a Coast Guard station. Not sure which one, but it will get you to one. But if your cell phone is connecting to a US tower, even if you're in Canadian waters, it will not work. So that surprises a lot of people. There's a lot of more details in the reference there, and this will be provided later. What is the Coast Guard radio looking for? They're looking for your position again, and the number of people on board. And you may notice that LOOR is really bugging people about making sure their crew list is up to date, including the skipper. So we actually know who's on board and the real number. And this is really important. There was a number of fatalities in offshore racing off San Francisco about a decade ago, who got so bad that the US Coast Guard stopped that type of racing because they had the authority to do that. And one of the issues were they were going on rescues and people didn't know the number of people on board. So why does that matter? Let's say you tell them there's 5 on board and there's really 6. So they recover 5 people. Oh, good, they got everybody. Except that poor 6th person is out there, and nobody's looking for them. So that's a real problem. The other problem, if you tell them that you have 6 on board and there's only 5, they'll still continue looking for the 6th person that doesn't exist. And you're often then putting the search and rescue people at risk. So it's important to know how many people are on board, and that includes the skipper. And that's why we make sure the crew lists are up to date with the right numbers. So there, as this thing there is, that those are your most important things if you're talking to Prescott. And we'll get to your position in a moment, but telling them off that you're off the spit is not really going to work if people don't really understand what you're talking about. What you should do is give your GPS positions. You can do it either way. The other thing is a distance or a bearing to a geographical landmark. The more information, the better. And it helps if you can say whether you're in US or Canadian waters, so they know who should be answering your call. But this is important. And any questions right up to this point? Okay. Okay, here's we talked about having a plan. You may have this written down so that you and your crew, so everybody knows what to do, is to call Mayday or Pan. Give your vessel name, your position again, how many people on board, and any other information you deem relevant. So again, you may want to have this as a bullet point near your radio, so everybody needs to know what they should be communicating in an emergency. Again, if it's an emergency or something's going wrong, people may forget some of these details. This just explains the difference between a Mayday and a Pan. Pan is there's no immediate danger, but it requires assistance, or it might devolve into a distress situation. So you can use a Mayday or a Pan. Now, the other thing we push is DSC and MMSI numbers. This little button on your radio makes things a lot easier. It's part of the digital selective calling features of the VHF radio, and it was introduced as part of the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System about a quarter century ago. This was designed for commercial shipping, but it works for pleasure craft and racers. Right now, most VHF radios come with DSC built in and with the built-in GPS as well. If you had an older radio, you had to connect your GPS to it or manually input your positions every 4 hours. And they're available as fixed stations or handheld. Just as an example, all the various manufacturers, an example of a handheld. All you have to do is lift the cover, press the DSC distress button for at least 5 seconds, and it'll take your position, assuming it has it, and it'll send out a message. How many of you have heard that strange warbling sound that doesn't go away for a couple of minutes? That's the stress signal that's been generated. All the radios tune into it that are a DSC capable. It'll display the MMSI number and the other information on your radio, and that warbling noise cannot be suppressed until the coast station acknowledges it. It'll continue to be broadcast until that. The other thing is then it automatically switches you over to 16 and all the rest of it, so you're ready to go. So here's an example, some MMSI information. I picked Dolly, which is the ship that took out the bridge in Baltimore, because its MMSI information has been all over the internet, so no privacy concerns. So there is a lot more information that is available to the coastal station that describes the vessel, your description, contact information, etc. So it gives the Coast Guard a start on what they're looking for. Now, we have some people from the US, and here's some national differences. If you're a Canadian boat in Canadian waters, anybody operating the radio has to have the operator certificate. You don't need a station license. In the US, if it's a US boat in US waters, you don't need an operator's license, nor do you need a station's license. In both cases, that's where the radio is optionally fitted and not required by law. However, the minute you cross the border, both are required. So if you're sailing into the US waters, you're supposed to have, and you're a Canadian vessel, you're supposed to have a station license. So this is one of the differences between Canada and US. And I discovered it when we were evaluating the differences between the US sailing and Sail Canada's coastal personal survival course, because they spent much more time on the US coast on radio. And then I twigged, oh, you don't need to have an operator certificate to operate a VHF radio in the US. The other thing in the US, there are 2 sources of an MMSI number. They are free, but in both Canada and the US, but you can get a domestic MMSI number from both US Power Squadrons and Shine Micro, except they don't work internationally. If you want an international one, you need to get it from the FCC, and international means Canada. So if you sail into Canadian waters or near Canadian waters, I would really recommend that you get an international MMSI number so that it works properly across the border. Just for the people that are wondering, this is the coverage of for VHF radio on the US side. So it overlaps, as you can see, how much of it goes over the border. And it comes to almost Toronto. And that's why we had the conversation between Buffalo Radio and the person off the Spit, is they were being picked up by Lewiston or Alcott. But those are where the US stations are. Here's the equivalent of JRCC Trenton is in Cleveland for the US part of Lake Ontario. Okay, as we mentioned, if you have to, you can try dialing *16 on a cell phone, but only in Canada. If you're in the US or being picked up by US towers, this won't work. And you may not know which towers are picking you up. I was in Youngstown running a race. We're talking about cell phones, and they mentioned that the people down at the river level on the US side had a tendency to be picked up by Canadian towers, and people on the Canadian shore by US towers. So you're not really sure when you're around the border whose tower is picking you up. So that's why you may not want to try to rely on *16 because it may not work where you are. Alternatives, try dialing 911, but I'm not sure who's going to pick it up, and they may not have any clue on how to handle on-water emergencies. Might be better than nothing. Yeah, mentioned calling direct. You have the cell numbers for Prescott and JRCC. You may want to have them because if you had to, you could phone them directly. But you have to have a charged phone, and you need to be able to connect it with a cell tower. If you have a cell phone that roaming is turned off, it may not work if you're too close to the US or in the US. If all else, you can, and nothing else is working, you can reach us and we'll reach out to JRC Trenton and Prescott Coast Guard Radio. We have a toll-free number and monitor that email address 7/24 during the races. If you get voicemail, leave a voicemail because it's emailed to several people. So we do have a recording. So if you have to contact us, leave us a message if we don't pick up. What you need to think about is, what are your plans? How many people have an emergency antenna? So what happens if your mast goes over and your antenna is on top of the mast? So one of the things is we'll get to it in the Category 3 requirements, is an emergency antenna. The other thing is, by broadcasting a Mayday or DSC alert, all the other boats in the area are notified, so they may be able to come to assistance, especially other racers. So the other thing is, everybody in the crew needs to understand, if you're summoning help, how do you give the information on your location so people understand it? This is the other ways of distress, signaling, flares, code flags, the black square and black dot on orange, arm signals, die markers, etc. Okay. And the other recognized signal in Canada is flame on a vessel. This was really designed, I think, for big ships where they could set a fire on a drum or something like that, and that would be recognized as a distress signal. The other thing you might want is a signal mirror. They're not that expensive, and this is a way to attract attention. Here's a guide, and it was designed for people going to sea for fishing, but there's a lot of information on search and rescue and what you need to do in it there. So you might want to look at that and see what might apply to you. The other interesting thing is, electronic visual distress signals are now legal in Canada for pleasure craft only. They have to meet the US Coast Guard requirements, and their instructions must be in English and French, and the manuals must be available in English and French. So if you buy the unit in the US and it doesn't have the French on it, it's not legal in Canada. But what it means is you replace the carriage requirements for all approved rocket, parachute flares, multi-star flares, handheld, or a water type flashlight. Daylight flares like a smoke flare are still required. They're very expensive right now, $300 or $400, but they have several advantages. They don't have to be replaced, and you don't have the disposal problem. So this is something to consider if you're going to have to go out and get a new set of flares, is doing the cost trade-off between getting one of these devices and getting your new flares. And they last a long time, so you're not liable to run into the situation that you've run out of all your flares if you're using this. I'm just going to briefly mention these. It needs a separate session, and because it's there's a lot of complications with it. There is an emergency position indicating radio beacon. What that was is part of the GMDSS was to go on ships that if the ship sank, it would be manually or automatically launched. It's got information that's put into the system so that when the rescue coordination centers get an alert by satellite, they know where it is. So this really works great if you're mid-ocean because there's nobody around. The PLB is basically the radio equivalent of an EPIRB, but for a person. So it's got less battery and it's connected to an individual. So this is great if you're out sailing in somewhere in ocean and you fall off, and it'll send a signal, but it'll take some time because it's got to go through the process to alert the right rescue coordination center. But that may be the only way to alert anybody if you're solo sailing in the middle of the ocean. The other thing that's come on the market is AIS, DCS man overboard devices. They use DSC or AIS to transmit distress signals. So what that means is that if you have the AIS receiver and one of these goes off using AIS, it'll pop up on your chart plotter to say there's a man overboard, and you can just navigate to it. They're limited range because AIS is based on VHF radio technology, and they're both limited to line of sight. But they're great because they can alert everybody in the area that there's an emergency. So this is something that's would be recommended in Lake Ontario. Now, because there's lots of boats around, it's a fast evolving area, and there's legal wrinkles depending on the country. So there's like probably a whole session that could be explained about the differences of them, etc. But these are something that you start to think about, especially if you're going offshore or something like that. And what's happening is the merging of a PLB with AIS. So there are units. It turns out that these two companies are really interconnected, so that's why they look the same. But it will do both the PLB to the satellite, and depending on which country you are in, it'll either do the DSC or AIS or both. So you have the combination of both. But right now they're $500 to $600. So if you're going to put a crew on each of a crew of 6, that's kind of expensive. But if you're a couple going offshore, maybe not so. So this is something, again, to think about, and hopefully the price will come down and more people will come into the market with them. Okay, a final caveat is remember that VHF is line of sight. So the material here is been focused on Lake Ontario. The principles and concepts apply elsewhere, but maybe not so, it may not be the same on Blue Water or Lake Superior, because I showed the charts that showed the radio coverage of Lake Ontario. Well, if you look at the same charts for Lake Superior, there's lots of places where there is no coverage. So therefore, the DSC or AIS manover board won't work in those areas unless there's another ship close by. That's why you might want a PLB that goes up to the satellite. But if you're out of range of coastal stations, alternatives are the EPIRB, PLB. There are SSB radios, which if you have your radio operator's license, you can use, and their range about 200 miles offshore. Satellite phones, in fact, the Global Maritime System that we talked about that turned out DSC and AIS, rely highly on satellite phones. And in fact, the old-fashioned radio operator is long gone off most large commercial ships because they're using sat phones. You could use a satellite service like Starlink, or you could have an amateur radio license. And there's a lot of people that do go offshore. That's what they do for long distance communications. Okay, now you have to, in summary, you need to think ahead. You don't want to be in this position, oh, where's the emergency antenna? What do I have to say, etc. And that's why everybody in the crew needs to be on the same book, same page. So that's why you need to discuss what to do in an emergency. We'll talk, you need to have the equipment. Safe boating guide requirements if you're a pleasure craft. We'll get into the race requirements in a moment, and anything else that you feel necessary or comforting. The other thing, yeah, if you got cell phones, oh yeah, but how many people cell phone have died on the 300? So you need to make sure you have a way of charging them. The other thing is documentation on how you use the equipment. You have the manuals and know how to use it. You're familiar with it. You may want to have simple key instructions located by or attached to the equipment so somebody else can use it who's not necessarily as familiar. And again, can't stress this enough. You need to practice using the equipment. Some of the new VHF radios don't have any buttons on them. They're just sort of some push manual menu or something like that. And they're really hard to figure out if you never read the manual. So you need to practice how to use it. Test the equipment as permitted by law. There's certain things like EPIRBs and etc. where there is a test sequence that you can do. So you need to understand, so that it's important to read the manual on how you test your equipment. Okay, LOOR requirements. All LOOR requirements, include the D races, require you to have a radio that operates on 68, 69, or 71. That's critical for the communications at the start or the finish. If it's DSC capable, it must have an MSI number. And don't forget, MMSI numbers are free, but we do request them and we do bug people about them. The other thing is a cell phone. That's one of the informations you have to put in your registration, is the boat emergency number. Okay, just a minor point. You also need to put in your emergency contacts and how to reach them. And sometimes the emergency contact is the other crew member on the boat. That's not what we're looking for. We were looking for an emergency contact on shore. The category 3, which are for the 300 Susan Hood and Losh race 4, the 100-miler overnight rate, you have to have a 25-watt DSC capable radio with that masthead antenna and an emergency antenna. You need a VHF for the grab bags, and they can count as the second radio. The day races just require 2 VHF radios, both of which can be handhelds. Now we go on to any questions, discussions.
Yeah, Graham, I have a couple of questions.
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm coming from the US
Mhm.
and I don't have a VH operator certification or station license. I did have FCC MMSI for my DSC radio, but what do I need to do to get the operator certification and the station license?
You have to pay money, and I can't really comment whether anybody's ever been checked for this if they cross the border.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just telling you what the law is, how well it's enforced in either direction. It's something that's I'd like to avoid.
Um, is there any uh, is there a requirement for one person or requirement for everyone in the crew?
It would be for everybody anybody who's operating the radio. It's the
Mm,
rule. Okay. So I suspect there's a lot of people that are violating the laws in by their direction.
okay.
Yeah. But I'm just pointing out what it is,
Hmm.
doing our due diligence.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So just a quick thing, we're always looking for volunteers. Uh, thank you for attending. In next Tuesday, we'll talk about the mentored class, which is a mechanism to allow cruisers, couples to come into racing. If anybody's interested, we'd like to thank our sponsors, and uh, we'll be sending this out. And there's a lot of publications and information that's available uh, that might want to look at and have available or review. But it's key to think about what you're going to do in an emergency. What happens if the boat is on its side and you can't reach the radio, etc. Uh, I mean, we're not, having a 100-page book doesn't work either, but having conceptually discussed who's going to do what in an emergency is going to help you a great deal. Understanding that what information the Coast Guard radio, whether it's US or Canadian, is looking for will help. Having a DSC radio with an MSI number programmed in properly means that that information is automatically available and is sent out. So that means you aren't fumbling around to figure out, well, what's the lat long, where am I, or whatever, while you're trying to get off the boat while it's sinking. That is key to getting aid to you. So any any other things you want people have questions on or like to discuss? If not, thank you very much and expect an email in a day or so with the presentation. So you'll have the links and the recording will also be posted on our YouTube channel.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay.
Good summary.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because we've had a couple of incidents last year where people were fumbling. They were close to the U.S. waters, so they tried star 16. Oh, it didn't work, etc. Their radio got fried, so that's why you need to know where make sure. Yeah, you got a second handheld, but is it buried away or whatever? So you have to make sure things are readily available. That's why the equipment position diagram really helps. And going over that with if you any new crew you have on. So, spending 5 minutes just talking about things before you go out racing is going to really make it safer for you. So So I'll hang on for a couple of minutes in case anybody has any questions, but thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Graham. That was a great presentation. We appreciate that.
Welcome.